Brilliant. Oh, hi. You must be here for Chapter 10 of Fred, Wizard in Training. So here is Chapter 10 of Fred, Wizard in Training. Chapter 10. Fred started to move cautiously across the valley, looking for any signs of the creature. The ground was still roasting hot, and he could feel the soles of his shoes starting to melt in the heat. He quickened his pace, skipping between boulders and deep craters created in the earlier mayhem. His heart raced. His senses were alert, on edge, waiting for the lizard to emerge at any moment, ready to eat him whole or roast him there and then. As Fred moved forward, a thought struck him. The craters. They weren't just craters. They were too orderly, too similar. They appeared one after the other, slightly to the left and slightly to the right. These were footprints. Giant, terrifying footprints. Footprints that belonged to the lizard. Fred followed them closely. Now, as far as he could see, he was the only wizard around. It was just him and the lizard, wherever it was. Soon it would just be the lizard, he worried. All the doubts he'd managed to banish just moments before swallowed him again. Give up. Go home and have a cup of tea. All the other wizards have perished or given up, so what chance do you have? He could feel the panic wash over him, causing his stomach to knot and his chest to tighten. He suddenly felt very lonely. The footprint craters came to an end. Fred raised his gaze from the ground to the mouth of the cave that now lay in front of him. He crept a little closer. He could hear a deep, steady rumbling sound, which drowned out the sound of his own heavy breaths. He felt the ground vibrating beneath his feet, reminded him of just how enormous the beast really was. A shudder ran down his spine. Each of his senses seemed heightened, and he could smell the charred rock and burnt soil, victims of the monster's anger. He stood at the side of the cave, wanting to peer in but fearful of being seen by the lizard. Struck by an idea, Fred took up his backpack and reached inside, pulling out the 2 spoons. Using the gum he'd saved from the bus journey, he fixed the spoons together by their handles, so the 2 round spoon heads were now at either end of a new, longer implement. He breathed on the shinier of the 2, then buffed it with his shirt until it was polished enough to show his reflection. Bending it slightly, he leaned against the rock at the edge of the cave's entrance, before holding his makeshift tool at arm's length in front of him. Fred carefully handled the spoon until he found the perfect position to see the inside of the cave reflected on its metal surface. Craning his neck, he saw in the spoon the huge, scaly body rising and falling with each breath the monster took. There, inside the cave, the lizard lay deeply asleep. It snored away happily, its belly full of magic and the wizards and witches it had greedily gobbled up for lunch. Fred slumped down against the outside of the cave, needing to think. It quickly dawned on him that he didn't have a clue what to do next. He hadn't planned this bit of his adventure. In fact, he hadn't planned any of it. For all the hours he'd spent thinking about the lizard and the competition, he'd never considered how he'd actually come away with its tail. Yet there it was, staring him in the face. He'd got much further than he'd ever thought possible. He wished he could just yank it off and walk out of the cave, but it could be as easy as that. But it couldn't. He'd have to slice it off, and there was nothing in his backpack sharp enough to cut off the lizard's tail. Using his wand would be useless. He didn't know how to conjure a knife, nor use magic to cut things. And anyway, any such attempt was bound to wake the lizard and result in certain death. Fred didn't much fancy the possibility of death, let alone the certainty of it. The harder Fred thought, the further away the answer seemed, and he realised just how stupid he'd been. What on earth was he going to do? There wasn't a spell in the wizarding world that could help him. Well, at least not one that he could do. It was hopeless. How foolish he'd been to think that there was even the tiniest chance that he might pull it off. That he, a small 8-year-old boy, useless at magic, could outperform experienced, talented witches and wizards and outwit the beast they'd succumbed to. Fred thought of his brothers and Marvin and envied them more than ever. They'd know what to do, what magic to use. How he longed to be a proper wizard, with tricks up his sleeve that he could actually perform. With a numb bottom and knees that were aching from sitting awkwardly for so long, Fred eventually realised that he had no choice but to head inside and hope for the best. He needed the tail, the prize, the tuition from Merlin. It was his only hope of getting better at magic. He'd have to improvise, to come up with a plan as he went. There was nothing else for it. He pushed himself off the floor. He took several long, deep breaths to compose himself and slow his racing heart. Cautiously, Nervously, he entered the cave. Fred snuck as quietly as he could past the sleeping lizard's head. It was the last place he wanted to be if the beast suddenly woke up. He didn't really want to be near its tail either. One swipe from that would finish him off. He settled on lingering near its middle, the least dangerous part he could think of. Then, out of desperation and not knowing what else to do, Fred searched inside his backpack again for anything that might help. He removed the items one by one. He slipped the torch into his pocket, but didn't dare turn it on for fear of waking the monster. He piled the raincoat, sun hat and pants neatly to one side. He couldn't see a use for them. He placed the packet of crisps on top. The library card was a waste of space, and so too was his grand's parking permit. He couldn't see how they could help him one bit. The book about pigeons was an enchanting page-turner, but other than entertaining Fred for a few minutes, it would be no use at all. The rest of the items were no better, although Fred thought that the statue of the Sultan of Scarborough would work nicely as a way to spruce up the cave a bit. Surely there had to be something he could use. He turned the bag upside down and shook it gently. Out bounced the conker. It echoed through the cave. "Don't wake up! Don't wake up!" Fred begged the lizard under his breath as he chased after the conker as quietly as he could. Towards the back of the cave, he finally managed to dive on top of it and smother the noise of its bounces. The lizard grunted loudly. Fred kept as still as a statue. The lizard shuffled a little, its great tail shifting from one side of its body to the other, but it remained asleep. Fred breathed a huge sigh of relief. As he rose to his feet, he spotted something glistening in the tiny beam of light that shone through a crack in the ceiling of the cave. Fred bent down and studied it. He ran his fingers along its smooth, beautiful surface. He picked it up, needing both his arms and all his might to bear its weight. He couldn't help but smile. In his hands, perfectly preserved, was a section of glorious, shiny tail, a tail that the lizard had shed. Fred couldn't believe his luck. He placed the tail carefully back on the ground, silently repacked his backpack, and flung it over his shoulder. He needed to get away fast before the lizard woke up. He picked up the tail again and made for the cave entrance. His arms burned under the tail's weight, his legs buckling under the strain. This was going to be harder than he thought. As he readjusted his hold, a heavy, clumsy shuffling sound stopped him in his tracks. Fred looked behind him. Two marbled, lava-like, golden eyes flashed back at his own, and as their gazes met, the lizard's black vertical pupils seemed to sharpen with excitement. It blinked, as if to check it was fully awake and seeing correctly. Then it opened its powerful jaws, wide enough for Fred to sneak a peek at what was sure to be his final resting place. Fred considered fleeing, but he knew it was futile. He couldn't outrun the lizard or its ferocious breath. This time, it really was it. Fred braced himself. He closed his eyes and hid his face behind his raised arm as if this would somehow offer some protection against what was to come. He stood there waiting for his short, unfulfilled little life to come to a horrible end. And that is the end of chapter 10. What a cliffhanger. Perhaps you'll be back for chapter 11 tomorrow. Who knows?